Hello everyone! Welcome to another lesson with Rivera Fine Art Studios. Today I wanted to talk about painting flesh tones. Flesh tones can often be very challenging because the colors are so subtle. There's not a lot of high chroma colors or high saturation colors. Everything is muted. So when we're dealing with flesh tones, we first want to try to simplify the color as much as possible, and we want to think about light and dark. Light and dark is what gives the illusion of form, light and shadow. It brings out the form. Color is then added on top of that with a technique such as this. So this is an old demonstration that I did for a Secret Techniques of the Old Masters class, which I teach periodically. And this is actually a copy of a painting by the artist William Bouguereau. And I've left each layer unfinished to show how I've built the color up. So the first thing I do is I start with a toned ground, which is just this area all around the figure. And that's just using burnt umber and raw sienna and a little bit of white. So it creates a very sort of neutral brown tone. Now the advantage of working on a toned ground is that can actually be used to give an undertone to the color. So if I'm working with a palette with a lot of warmer colors, as is the case here, that brown helps to provide a warm undertone for the painting. The other thing that a toned ground does is it allows me to gauge my values a little bit more easily because I'm starting in this case with a midtone. So when I'm working lights into that, I can see the range between the lights and the midtone. And the same is true of the darks. When I add my darker shadows, I can see the range between the darks and the midtone, which is a lot easier than starting with a white ground. It's much harder to gauge your value range when you're starting with your lightest value. So quickly, I'm just going to kind of run through everything that I've done here in each layer, and these are all techniques that I am going to be teaching very soon in my portrait painting masterclass, which will be offered on my website, which is www.riverafinearts.com. But I'll just kind of briefly go through this. This is the first layer, which is actually, I did a drawing of this first in pencil. And in that drawing, I did a little bit of shading just to figure out where my light and my dark shapes would be. Then I did a tracing of that drawing, and I traced it onto my panel with paint. And this method is called a cartoon transfer, where I'm just really tracing out the major lines, the outlines, the contour outlines, as well as the outlines of the shadow shapes, as seen in here in the foot. The next step was then just to go in with a light wash. In this case, I used raw umber. Again, I'm kind of sticking with that warmer palette. And I just filled in where my shadow shapes were. So a little bit of a light and dark variation here. I have a little bit of control over how dark or how light I can go with that wash, just based on how heavily I'm applying it. This is all done in just a single color, and it's all done semi-transparently. The next layer would be this layer right here, where the flesh tones become somewhat gray. So here I'm just continuing to build upon my value structure, and I'm adding opaque lights as well as shadows. I'm looking for the range of values now. I'm looking for how the value of the shadow and the light sort of transition into one another. So this is really just concentrating on values only, lights and darks. And for this layer, I used raw umber and white, and I mixed up a full range from dark to light of just using the raw umber and the white. Okay, and then the next layer is where I start to really explore some of the flesh tones. I start looking for more warm and cool. I'm adding some pinks here and some very dull yellows. This layer is still done with a limited palette, so the color is not as bright as it's going to eventually be. I'm just using about 4 to 5 colors, and what I'm also doing is adjusting my values a little bit. So, you know, in here, this was a little bit too dark, so as I go in with this limited palette, I'm strengthening those lights. And that's actually pretty important because the next layer would be glazing, which is actually what we see up here in the face. So when you're glazing over a light color, it has a tendency to slightly darken that color. So the final layer is where I'm using just glazes, and glazes simply means a semi-transparent wash of paints. So it's done only where I have very strong hues. So in the pinks of the cheeks, those are a little bit stronger than the other flesh tones, also sort of the crimson color in the lips. So these are areas which are ideal for glazing. You can also adjust sort of the values or the hues or the chroma, the intensity of color with a glaze. So there's many, many purposes for glazing. Okay, and once again, these are all things that I will cover in much more depth in my online portrait painting class, which can be found on my website. I will be posting information on that very, very soon. So I will provide the link to my website in the description below. And that pretty much covers my lesson for today. So stay tuned. I will be posting another lesson either later this week or next week. And in the meantime, happy painting. Bye for now.